to become popular, fame, things like that. I mean, this industry just churns itself around because there's so many different opinions about it. People really enjoy it too. I tend to think that people find it entertaining, actually.
Well, I hope not, because, I mean, we're talking about a tragedy, not just for the people who lost their lives on 9/11, but also the millions in the Middle East who've suffered as a consequence in the fallout from 9/11. But I don't think anyone would go into this campaigning for a new inquiry and asking for the truth of the events because they enjoy the profile they get, because you just end up being vilified by the mainstream media.
I'm afraid unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to thank our guests today, Annie Michon, Richard Gage, and Ian Henschel. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
Well, the question isn't who or why anymore, so much as how. How could 200,000 tons of steel drop to the ground in under 11 seconds because of a fire? Well, over 1,000 architects and engineers say it simply can't, not the way it happened on September 11th. And now they want a new investigation. Well, Tim King is the editor of SalemNews.com. He's been covering this issue for quite some time now, and he joins me live from Oregon. You know, Tim, RT has been covering this topic extensively over the years, and I found it very interesting that the first line of the piece you wrote said, quote, "The mainstream press is showing interest in a taboo, however glaring subject, the inconsistencies in the Bush White House 9/11 account." First of all, what are the inconsistencies here, and why do you think that the mainstream media has started to pay attention now?
Well, I think that part of it is that there are certain facts with things like the melting temperature of steel, and there are a lot of very, very known criteria about building implosions, and I think it's the fact that 1,000 engineers have signed on to this report now, and they're just saying it's physically impossible. The version. And a lot of us, I think, when the passports were showing up on the sidewalks of Manhattan just hours after the initial crash, really didn't have a lot of faith that we were going to get a real story. And I think that, after all this time with this many professionals, and these are high caliber professionals making these points, that we just have to pay attention, and now the mainstream media is too.
You also say, based on the interviews and research you had done, that a third building came down that day, wasn't hit by an airplane, but you write that it did contain a lot of records that certain members of the financial industry didn't miss. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, this was a building that was a World Bank building, and from our understanding from the research that's been done, there were just billions of dollars worth of gold down below. There were also a lot of records in that building that they conveniently disappeared. This is Security and Loan Administration scandal, a lot of things along those lines. They were records that these groups were not sorry to see vanish into thin air. And Building 7, just the notion that it came down at all, when, as you said, it wasn't struck by an aircraft, I think, honestly, and I hate to say this, but I think half the Americans you could ask, how many buildings came down in New York that day? They would say 2, they would not say 3. And Building 7 was a skyscraper. It was not as tall as the 2 main buildings, but it was very substantial. And since jet fuel burns about the temperature of diesel, which isn't enough to melt steel in the first place, the notion of the third building coming down after not even being struck by an aircraft, it's pretty far out.
Well, I think it's safe to say that perhaps one of the reasons that this is not really written about or really talked about much in the mainstream media is that there is this sort of stigma around questioning the events of 9/11, that it's unpatriotic to do so. How would you respond to that?
I would say that's exactly the case, and that's what all of the researchers and reporters who have taken the time to go into this subject have dealt with. It's an instant call on patriotism, it's an instant call on ethics, but in reality it's just it's a case where some of us that have the factual data, we just can't go on not bringing this forward. It's just too important of a subject, and yeah, I do believe that Americans have really had the wool pulled over their eyes firmly for all of this time, and it's a very hard one when you are an American to face this and try to put your mind around it. It's so painful to consider what could have happened.
So does this piece in the Washington Times then signal that there could in fact be a formal inquiry, maybe a new investigation sometime in the near future?
I would like to think that. I think Mr. Farmer and some of the other members of the 9/11 Commission who we've written about, I'd like to hear their opinion on it. People that are now coming out and saying that the information that was put forth in that report was not all there, it was not correct, it was heavily influenced. The thing about this is that there are so many parts to it, And 9/11, happened in 3 different locations, if you will. And each of the, the Pentagon, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, New York, they all have their own major inconsistencies in the stories. So it's really, I think, much larger than any of us can ever really fully grasp. But it's coming forward slowly.
Tim King, SalemNews.com. I do want to thank you for your analysis.
Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, and joining us again now from Toronto is Eric Margolis. He's an accomplished international correspondent, been printed in many newspapers around the world, as author of the book American Raj, and has a website at ericmargolis.com. Thanks for joining us again, Eric.
Paul.
So in the first segment of our interview, we talked about the enormous size, almost $1 trillion of the U.S. military budget. And President Obama made it clear it's untouchable. So why is it so untouchable to take on the military budget?
Well, it shouldn't be untouchable. That's a ridiculous point. The U.S. is virtually bankrupt, and yet it continues to spend 50% of all military spending on the planet. Totally unnecessary, but it is the sacred cow, and the reason is Americans are constantly bombarded with nationalist propaganda. There's a new sense that the president has to be a war president. I think practically every president back to Teddy Roosevelt has somehow been in a war. That America's polls show Americans want their president. His first most important quality is to be a commander-in-chief. Imagine a presidency without war. It's hard to do. There's the military-industrial complex, which President Eisenhower warned us against 60 years ago, that is so powerful now that it and the oligarchs, financial oligarchs on Wall Street have become the primary power behind governments. And the fact is that the military-industrial complex has very cleverly put military plants in just about every state in the Union. And new aircraft like the F-22 is made all over the United States, so that it becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible, for congressmen and senators to vote for shutting down defense programs when it means loss of jobs in their own states.
Now, a lot of the spending's on foreign military bases. Even if you set aside the debate about the Afghan war and the Iraq war, which people can argue about, people in Washington argue about, was it necessary or not necessary, but the need for almost 1,000 foreign military bases, how much of that has to do with real geostrategic beliefs, and how much of that is about feeding this complex?
Well, there is a very strong imperialist impulse in Washington that believes that we have to have full spectrum dominance, just like the Imperialist Party in Imperial Britain before World War II, that we've got to, in effect, rule large parts of the world and keep the Pax Americana there. That's still a very ingrained idea in Washington, even amongst many Democrats. We see it affecting President Obama. And to do this, the U.S. maintains this huge, gargantuan, bloated defense budget aimed against an enemy that really is not apparent. But also, it's not just aircraft carriers and jet fighters that impose the Pax Americana. It's cash. We pay off and bribe countries and leaders all around the world. We're right now buying practically anything that moves in Pakistan. We pay billions to the Middle East and so on. So it's American money, even more than military power, that imposes our will. But all of this money to sustain the Pentagon and to buy off all the foreign countries is now being borrowed from Japan and China, and that just cannot go on forever.
In the debate and fight over Afghanistan, President Obama probably had more support from the Republican Party than he did from the Democratic Party. In fact, if it hadn't been for the Republicans being so gung-ho in support of him, he might have had trouble selling this in Washington. What do you make of that? How vulnerable is he to that? And what do you make of the Republican Party?
Well, Paul, the president is obviously intimidated by the military-industrial complex. He doesn't stand up to the military. When General McChrystal in Afghanistan demanded 40,000 more troops, he said, or we face defeat, Obama should have fired him on the spot. It was the most arrant act of insubordination I've seen since General MacArthur, who was fired by President Truman, demand of use of nuclear weapons in Korea. But his advisors around him sense that this is a very important political issue. The continued military